ओम आनंदमयी चैतन्यमयी सत्यमयी परमे ओम पूर्णमद पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। Namaste and welcome to Insightful Conversations at Oro Bharati Sri Aurobindo Society. And today we have with us Nitin Sridharji, who has recently authored Isha Upanishad, an English commentary. So we'll be having conversation with him on the broad topic of Dharma, Shastra, and the future society. And before we begin, I would just like to invite Isha Bidwaikar. She's a research and editorial assistant at Oro Bharati to introduce Nitinji. And before the introduction, let me just sort of introduce what Oro Bharati is. Oro Bharati is the vertical of Sri Aurobindo Society that studies and researches Indian culture, Indian society in the light of the vision of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother for the future of India, for the future of India's role for the world and humanity. And Renaissance is the monthly e-journal of Oro Bharati, through which we are having this series of insightful conversations with various authors, thinkers, storytellers, artists, writers, and people who are generally working for the overall renaissance of India, Indian culture and society. So with that brief introduction, Isha, would you like to introduce our guest, Nitinji?
Yes, thank you, Balaji. So as you said, Nitinji is the author of his latest commentary on Isha Upanishad, that is in English. And he is also the author of Menstruation Across Cultures, a historical perspective, a very widely read book. And his third book to mention here is Musings on Hinduism, which discusses about the uh, Indian religion and society. He's also the curator of Advait Academy, which is responsible for the spread of Advait Vedanta work. And he is the editor of India Facts. So he was the editor of India Facts and is the consulting editor of Indic Today magazine, an online portal for uh, spreading of Indian religion, society, and culture. And he has a degree in civil engineering, and he writes passionately about politics, religion, spirituality, and ecology. That's for now. Thank you.
It's really good, Nitin, that you could take out some time and join us for this session today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good. So let me just begin with this first question. If you would like to just share briefly about your writing journey. I mean, you started off writing on politics, first of all, from engineering to get into Indian cultural studies, Indian religious, spiritual studies. So if you could just briefly mention a little bit about your writing journey, and then we'll come to your latest book.
Okay. Yeah. So it actually starts back when I was in school. Really, I mean, it starts with a kind of journey into philosophy per se. When I first read a book called Sophie's novel, Sophie's World. So I think it is basically a book written for teenagers, but introducing Western philosophy from Socrates to Descartes and others, right? So from there, kind of philosophical introspection on deeper questions. I mean, that's what stimulated me. And I always loved writing. Writing, I think, is a skill that that came naturally to me. So I was contributing some occasional columns to Pioneer newspaper when I was studying engineering, and I used to write then for a online portal called Vijayvani as well. But yeah, those were the times mostly I wrote on socio-political issues. Even now, I write on socio-political issues, but those having a civilizational uh, um, relevance, so to speak. So I always loved writing in that sense. But yeah, you can't survive by simply writing. So, that was my rationale, and that is how I got into engineering. I was in worked in construction field till 2015, but then I got an opportunity to change my career. So I took a gamble and said, let me see if I can survive by writing. So I joined in Newsgram, a online new online portal. It was started in 2015 itself as a staff writer. So I was supposed to write 2 to 3 articles every day. So for 6 months, I wrote every day. It was a small, big, medium-sized pieces on all kinds of topics under the sun. And then in 2016, I joined India Facts as its editor. And so I have been associated with India Facts till last year. And since 2017, I was working part time with Advaita Academy. And since last year, I moved full time into Advaita Academy. So this is how, in a sense, my interest in philosophy and my own spiritual journey, so to speak, from being an atheist in high school to rediscovering first the political aspects of Hindu civilization, and then the deeper philosophical and spiritual and sadhana aspects of Hindu dharma. So they have gone, in a sense, complement to each other. So when I was in construction field, I was deeply unhappy in the sense that I could not write, and most importantly, I could not do what I love. That is to write on things related to dharma, related to Hindu civilization, because so I always that is why I am writing. I am writing for civilization. Otherwise, I would simply sit in a corner perhaps and read a book. But yeah, so this is how it started, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. Great, great. Thank you for kind of just giving a very quick but a very deeply interesting overview of your journey so far. So you started off with musings on Hinduism. If we were to talk about books on Sanatan Dharma or the dharmic understanding of life, and I've read that book, and from there to Isha Upanishad. So I'm kind of curious why Upanishads and why specifically Isha Upanishad? Because as we all know, like this is one of the, like Sri Aurobindo has given great, commentaries, and he has talked about Isha Upanishad as the basis for a divine life in many ways. So, what attracted you about Isha Upanishad?
Interestingly, Isha Upanishad was the commentary to this is the first book I started to write. I started to work on it in 2013 and 14, I think, around much of the part one was written during that time. It so happened that it was half finished, and later I published musings on Hinduism and many other books over the years. So it has come out as sixth book, but this was the first book I started working. The first thing that I wanted to write as a book. And the story is really funny in a sense. It came out of a argument or a debate and a discussion on Facebook uh, regarding with a friend who who follows Aurobindo and his works. And it was the time then I was myself properly introduced to Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta of Adi Shankaracharya. But I had not studied any Upanishad at that point of time. There was a debate and discussion wherein um, it was, Shankara writes a particular interpretation of the Upanishad, and um, somebody like Sri Aurobindo writes a different interpretation. So this arose my curiosity, and so I thought, let me actually study this Upanishad. So, so because of that Facebook discussion and debate, so to speak, I thought, let me see for myself whether really the interpretations differ, or what is actually the Upanishad is saying. Let me study in deep. So this was back in 2013. Then I purchased some books on Upanishad, available translations, and I studied two commentaries that I studied in deep. Was first was Adi Shankaracharya's commentary, and its translation available in by Swami Gambhirananda especially. But I also consulted the original, of course, and also Sri Aurobindo's commentary. So this happened in 2013, 2013. So those 2-3 years, I spent a lot of time to study this Upanishad. But though I use the commentaries as for understanding, for a word by word, verse by verse understanding, I my way of studying was more of a reflection and trying to unknot the philosophy of the Upanishad on my own basis, on my own rationality. I especially there are certain verses in this Upanishad which are really tricky in the sense they are open to multiple interpretations. So I used to reflect a lot upon them about how different ways it could be interpreted and whether they are logically sustainable in the overall framework of philosophy, in the overall framework of Indian worldview, so to speak, Hindu worldview, so to speak. So, in a sense, this writing of the commentary also helped me to further, refine my own understanding, because that is the writing is my way of, you know, uh, more stabilizing my own understanding, more refining, polishing them, and because as I write, then a lot of questions arise, and then I had to resolve those questions. So was really a spiritual journey, so to speak. The writing itself was a sadhana to me, and so the first part I wrote in the first draft around 2013 and 2014, and then the second part of the book I wrote in 2016 and 2017, and finally I kind of finished it. I thought now bahut ho gaya, too much it has happened, too many years. So let me finish it up. So in 2018 and 19, I just polished the whole thing, added whatever was left. 1 or 2 chapters were remaining to be written, so I wrote them and got the diacritic marks and all, put it down. So it's a work of around 7 years. Finally, it is out this year. You're on mute, yeah.
Yes. I think you put it very nicely. It's sadhana, and 7 years to stay on a project. I mean, of course, the significance of the Isha Upanishad itself. I mean, we can spend not just 70 years, whole lifetime studying just those 18 verses, because it's not just about really studying or understanding through mind. It is through, like what you said, the meditating on this. And so I have a question about that as well coming up, but I want to see if, Isha, you would like to ask something now, something based on what Nitinji has shared, if you have any quick question or comment.
Whatever he said is pretty much clear about his journey and what inspired him to write through. So
yeah.
So for now, it's pretty much clear.
Okay. What has been your like you said, so much time that you have spent on contemplating and meditating on what each of these verses are saying. Was there any particular verse that your inmost being sort of resonated most with? Like, for example, my own study of this Isha Upanishad, and maybe because I'm also coming from Sri Aurobindonian perspective on this, just the very first Isha Vasyam Idam Sarvam, just this one idea itself, one concept, I don't even want to use the word concept, or one truth itself, this whole is for the inhabitation of the Lord. That itself, one can spend like weeks and weeks and months just reflecting on that. So, what was your experience like, if you want to share about it? How did it impact you inwardly, your inner journey in this process? If you could share a little about that.
Yeah, I think I must share that this was the first Upanishad I have studied. After Isha Upanishad, I studied Kena Upanishad and Mandukya and some others too, a little bit here and there. But this was the first Upanishad. And the most important thing that struck me was in this Upanishad is the kind of it embeds within itself the entirety of Vedantic worldview, the entirety of Hindu worldview. I mean, the essence of it, so to speak, because and it has something to offer for everybody, for every person, no matter in what stage he or she is in the spiritual journey. And from this perspective, I found the first three verses are the most important verses, and because it speaks about the first verse speaks about those who are dispassionate and how they have to pursue the Atmagyana, the Nivritti Marga is the technical term in Vedanta, that the path of renunciation. And the second verse speaks about those who do not have that dispassion, how should they live in this world? The Pravritti Marga, how should they live in this world? How should they negotiate with issues and the problems and the obstacles that come up in the world? And the third verse, which is, I think, which is most ignored in normal discourse, is the third verse. And I found it very important because it speaks about the fate of those who are neither eligible for the path of dispassion and renunciation, and do not who deliberately ignore the path of dharma, which is the path of the living in the world, and and choose to indulge in artha and kama in a very reckless manner. So what is their fate? What will happen? What is the some sort of fruit of their action? What is the kind of journey they will take? This I found the most interesting. But if I have to choose any particular verse, of course the first verse is my favorite, the Ishavasyam Idam Sarvam, and I simply love it. I especially love the phrase of Jagatyam Jagat, and uh, the all the words in that first verse I love. Tena Tektena Bunjita and all those things. But I also very much love this. I think it is verse number 6 and 7, where it speaks about Yastu Sarvani Bhutani Atmanye Vanupashyati Sarva Bhuteshu Chatmanam Tato na Jigupsate Yasmin Sarvani Bhutani Atmaiva Bhut Vijanataha Tatra Ko Moha Kahashoka Ekatvam Anupashyati. I think this is the ultimate goal of life. This state, it basically describes what is a Jivan Mukta, what is the highest goal, irrespective of the path. We can all, take up different paths. We have so many paths in Sanatana Dharma. There is no limit to the path, right? We have so many deities and we have so many paths. Any path you take, ultimately, as far as the Upanishadic teachings are concerned, that is the highest goal of Brahma Vidya, wherein one perceives oneself, everything. That is, one perceives the truth alone, the non-dual, the infinite, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma alone. So all the objects will then be understood in their real nature as being this self. So all beings are self, and the self in all beings. That is what it is. Ekatvam Anupashyate. There is only one. Here the one is not a numerical entity. One is the infinity, Anantam, Anandam. So this is perhaps I love this two verses because it kind of anchors. It helps us to anchor ourselves in the ultimate reality, even though we are not realized persons at this point of time, and that is a goal we have to attain. But anchoring ourselves, our life into this goal helps us in our everyday journey as well. It helps us to wade through the problems. It helps us. It going back to this again and again helps us to wade through the issues that we face in life. It may be any kind of issues.
I totally agree and resonate with what you have just said. As I was mentioning to you earlier, this Swadhyaya session that I facilitate, I think verses 6 and 7, we spent the most number of weeks, last 4 or 5 weeks, we've been kind of reflecting on that. Everything from spiritual philosophy to pandemic, everything gets, covered under that as to what should be our response and how to work on this ekatvam and things like that. So yes, and of course I also thought very interesting your comment about the verse number 3, the fate of those who try to. Sri Aurobindo interprets it differently as to those who try to cut the normal lifespan short. He also talks about it like that in the sense. So I think that is also something that has a very practical value also, especially in times like these, where we see so much of sort of mental disturbances and disorders, and not to get a sense of depression, sink into any sense of depression, but to live the given life and work through all the challenges in a dharmic sort of way. So that is again a very, very, I think that's a very practical, one of the most practical verses, really valuable for.
The beauty of this Upanishad is it has layers of interpretation.
Yes.
And each building upon each other. It is not that the interpretations are completely unconnected or disconnected. You have to accept A, then you have to reject B.
Right.
At least in this case of this Upanishad, that is not so. In my personal experience, I found that we can accept both A and B as true.
Yes.
At the same time, at least in the case of this Upanishad.
Absolutely. In fact, Sri Aurobindo's key idea about this Upanishad is exactly this, that it's about reconciliation of what seems like the extremes, how it synthesizes and harmonizes those extremes. So whether it is birth, non-birth, or, vidya, or, pravritti marg or nivritti marg, all those kinds of things. So let's move on to a little bit about, you said this is the first Upanishad that you started with, but one of the very important observations that I think any reader would make when they look at this book, when they study your commentary, is you have referred to so many other Upanishads, so many other texts that you have been reading while you are reflecting on Isha Upanishad. So you have spent a lot of time studying scriptures. So from your perspective, as a young, Indian in today's day and age, what do you think is the real significance or the real value of studying scripture, and what should be one's approach to, study the scripture?
I have a twofold answer. In the first sense is from an individual's perspective, the most visible utility of studying Shastra is that it helps us to anchor ourselves in a more strong basis. It helps us to anchor ourselves in dharma, anchor ourselves in knowledge, and provides a guide, a pointer how and when frameworks, and equips us to deal with life, to approach life in a more knowledgeable way, more nuanced way, and more in a way which is overall beneficial to us. The definition of dharma is that which gives abhyudaya and nishreyasa, right? But what is the source of dharma? From where will you know this is dharma and that is dharma? The actions do not themselves speak to us and say that I am dharma, I am adharma, right? So the source is the Shastra. The Shastra is the Pramana. So this is the second part. What is the role of Shastra in Hindu perspective, in the Hindu worldview? And I find that this is something which is completely misunderstood by most people, especially in people who are, even those who are influenced by Hindu philosophy in some way, even they have this fundamental misunderstanding about the role of Shastra. The role of Shastra, what is a Shastra? It is a bunch of words and sentences, right? So it is a Shabda. It's a Shabda Rashi, so to speak, right? So what is it? So its role is to reveal something, reveal knowledge, impart knowledge. So this is what is called as in the traditional, in the technical term as Shabda Pramana. We have this beautiful notion of Pramana, and Pramana means that which is a source of knowledge, which reveals correct knowledge, which reveals right cognition. And we accept 6 kinds of different Pramanas. One is Pratyaksha, which is everybody knows, the empirical. But apart from this empirical as well as logical, which is Anumana, the inference, we accept this Shabda Pramana as the most important one. And this is what most people today are find inconvenient to accept, because we have been trained in a certain way from our education system to look at only empirical evidence, something that is proved in a laboratory, for example, as truth. The criteria of verifiability and falsifiability as the foundation of truth. This is the modern education. But this criteria is problematic because its application is very limited. For example, a Shabda, say, for example, Veda, what it reveals, it cannot be either verified or falsified by empirical knowledge. So by definition, Veda reveals something which is beyond the reach of the senses. So the studying of the Shastra, what is the basic, why we are studying? So it reveals to us knowledge which is not available to us from other means, other pramanas, be it pratyaksha or the direct perception, empirical knowledge, or anumana, that is inference, or other kinds. So what is the twofold knowledge that the Veda, basically Veda reveals, is one is dharma, the other is Brahma Vidya. It reveals these two things. And under this, you can add upasana, you can add many other things and different shastras. For example, Kama Shastra reveals about love making and other things related to it. Artha Shastra is about politics and administration, such things. And Dharma Shastra or the Smritis are basically about dharma. The Shastra acts as a codifier, acts as a sum total of all our knowledge that we that have been discovered or understood over the last many millennia. So this is a repository of knowledge. The texts are the repository of knowledge, however you see it, whether it is divine in origin, whether it is apaurushaya, or it is human in origin. For example, Ayurvedic texts like Charaka and Ashashruta, they are human origin, right? So whatever be the nature of this text, the Shastra reveals knowledge, and that is its greatest value, that we are able to approach them, engage with them, introspect them, and we learn the teaching, then we can apply it in our own lives. How I apply could be very different from how you apply, and what teachings are relevant to me will not be relevant to you. A good example is, and within the confines of the Dharma Shastra, the Dharma Shastra reveals dharma. What is dharma? Dharma means the actions which leads us to which are beneficial, which leads us to abhyudaya nishresa, that is material and spiritual well-being. The opposite is adharma, that which leads to sorrow. So the texts reveal what kind of actions are beneficial to which people, and the same actions could be non-beneficial to some other people. This knowledge it reveals. It reveals about, for example, Stri Dharma, which is relevant to women, which is the course of action which gives Abhyudaya Nishresa to women. That is not same for others. So this kind of knowledge is what the Shastra reveals. And the more we engage with these texts, the more insightful, more insights we'll gain, which will be very useful in our day-to-day life. I mean, just for example, very small example we can take up. When we were children, a lot of times, we go out to buy something in a shop. Sometimes the shopkeeper gives us more change than necessary. What is our first instinct is to take the money silently and come back to home. But the Shastra says that is steyam. Steyam means it's stealing. Even though we are not technically stealing, we are not a robber, but even taking what does not belong to us is there. And there are a lot of stories in Itihasa Puranas about all these things, right? So if you're teaching children from young age these stories, Satyakama Javala, stories about Nachiketan, stories about Markandeya, so many people, these stories helps us to ingrain these tenets of dharma in the minds of the young people. It helps us, even me. I love stories because the stories help gives a lot of scope for reflection, right? So this is why the Shastras are important, especially Itihasa Puranas are most important. Let me state it explicitly. Not everyone needs to study Upanishad. Not everyone needs to study Smritis. See, they have a particular, not everybody studies Natya Shastra, for example. See, there are certain technical Shastras which are studied by those who are in that field of study, which is relevant to them. But there are also other Shastras, which like Puranas, like Itihasas, which whose purpose is to reach it out to masses, to everybody, so that everybody can find something useful. So it's kind of encyclopedia. So we need to take up in a big way. So our Dadi Amma stories that happened in previous days. They the stories they came up were in this folk tale, come Mahabharata, come Puranas, this tradition, right? But we have lost that. Now the current generation, we don't have it. So we have to read books to gain this stories, knowledge of stories, and recreate this cycle. So I see it, this is the utility of studying Shastra. Whatever text, whatever Shastra you study, you can improve the quality of your life. You can know the goals of your life. For example, a few years back, I did a talk to the first year students of my engineering in my um, alma mater, where I asked them, how many of you have heard of the term Purushartha? Not a single person in 150 plus students. I think it was not 150, it was 300 plus students. Not a single person had heard of the term Purushartha. Just imagine. Not a single student had heard of the term Purushartha. So what is happening from childhood? The parents tell the kids, you have to earn money, you have to get a job, you have to get settled, get a job, get settled, go abroad, do this. Nobody is teaching them that you have to find meaning in life. Nobody is teaching them that find do something that you find fulfilling in life. That is self, that leads to you to self-actualization. If I have to borrow from the modern terminologies, right? Self-actualization, self-realization. Nobody is telling them to seek meaning in life. And this is the fundamental problem of modernity and modern world. So we need studying Shastras introduces these frameworks, the frameworks of Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, framework of Varnashrama, the framework of Shrishti, Sthiti, Laya. These frameworks act as anchors. When the most, just for example, now we have pandemic, right? Dealing with death is not easy. No matter how much philosophically oriented we are, how much theoretically oriented we are, it is not easy to cope up. Our rituals are designed in such a way so that we can cope up with them. An understanding of philosophy combined with the practical aspects of ritual is a sure recipe to help us to cope up with problems in life, anchoring our life, and healing ourselves. An issue that is happening today is a lot of Vedanta implies that you ignore the rituals. You think the rituals are, superstition. Now we are spiritual but not religious. These are all nonsensical memes. There is nothing spiritual without religion. There is nothing philosophical. There is nothing adhyatmic without the rituals. The Vedantic argument that karma and jnana do not go together is true, but it is being misunderstood today. It has a completely different meaning in a different context. In the context of a renunciator, in the context of a sannyasi who has renounced all his this Agni Karya and other karmanushtana, for him, he practices nididhyasana and all. That is a different thing. In for people like us who are in this world, rituals, samskaras, all these are very important. That is why important big portion of my book is on the samskaras. On the because nobody else teaches this. When they teach Isha Upanishad, they don't teach you the importance of pravritti marga. The second verse speaks about pravritti, right? Kurvanne vahe karmani jiji vishe chatam samaha evam tvai na anyadayatosti na lipyate karmanare. I might have missed one or two words in between the verse. So you have to live in this world. If you have a desire, then you have to perform karma. What kind of karma? Dharmic karma. What is dharma? That is what the Shastras like Veda and Smritis, everybody thing says. So what is our Swadharma? We have to do. Sorry, I took a long time to answer this question.
No. I think you brought in a lot of different. You kind of like preempted some of the questions that were going on in my head. So, and some of the examples you gave are very relevant as well. And one, I will just pick on one specific example you gave, and to kind of just give a little different direction to our conversation here. You said about Istri Dharma, for example. And at this point, I think maybe in our conversation, we can come back to Dharma a little bit in general later on, but about picking up on the Istri Dharma and this book that you wrote on menstruation across cultures. That I think Isha was very intrigued with because this was her first exposure to the book. So I know Isha has given some thought to that, and she has some questions as a young woman. So Isha, would you like to come into the conversation now?
Yes, Belu. Yes, Beluji. So, Nitin ji, what really compelled you to write at such a length about this book? Like you being a man could have easily ignored the subject, just shut your eyes and just forget it. But what made you do such extensive research on the subject? It's a fantastic book. I mean, I haven't read the whole thing, just the reviews and summary, but it's amazing.
The all things happened because of the Shabarimala issue. How the issue started, back in 2015 and 16, it was again the whole issue was there, and media, lot of narratives in the media was happening. But the mainstream media narrative, there are two aspects to the narrative. One was about the temple itself and how the entry, the prevention of entry of certain age group of women in the temple is not an anti-equality, anti-women and such nonsense. And that was countered by me and by many others better than me, showing how the temple practice is based on the texts, based on the instructions of Ayyappa Swami itself. And the deity has a particular nature of Naishtika Brahmachari, and it has nothing to do with menstruation. But the fact is, the second narrative in the media was that it was because of menstruation, and that in Hinduism, in Hindu culture, women are looked down upon because of menstruation. They are treated badly. They are treated demeaningfully. They are cancelled, so to speak, because of menstruation. So this was the underlying narrative, meta narrative, so to speak, behind the Shabarimala narrative in the mainstream media. Now, at that point of time, I must confess that I was not familiar with the notion of Shaucha, Ashaucha, and all. And I did not much subscribe to this purity, impurity thing as well. But what I wanted, this whole narrative, it made me think, what is the truth? I mean, is there really a truth in it? Because by that time, my journey from atheism to Hindu Dharma had kind of complete, in the sense I had rediscovered my Shraddha in the Shastras, my Shraddha in the traditions. So I I thought that let me study and see what is truth. Is there really the Shastra says that there is some kind of impurity? And if it does, what does it mean in what context? So this led me to study for the next 6 months in 2015, 2016. I spent some 6 months talking to people, collecting references from various Dharmashastras. I was not much familiar with Smritis and Dharmashastra at that point of time. So I had good friends online on Facebook and all. So who I called them, I messaged them, I asked for the references. And then I made an independent study of these primary texts, not some second. Interestingly, nobody has written on this topic before me. There was just one paper by a Western scholar called as Orthodox Hindu Perspective of Menstruation. It is filled with the routine prejudice, the biases and misleading conclusions. So I made an independent study for my own sake, for my understanding. I had never planned to write a book. I studied for my own sake. And then as I was studied for 3, 4 months, 5 months, I realized that there is a serious problem. That the kind of meaning we are attributing to the terms like impurity, this meaning has no relevance in the Hindu traditional perspective. The impurity is an English term, and this English term, English language is rooted in Christian theology. It's a language of Christian culture, right? The Western culture. And it is in the Christian text, it is in the Bible and the other traditions that impurity has a particular notion of sinfulness. And it is this sinfulness which is negative. So in the West, this notion has been critiqued. It has been criticized a lot by a lot of scholars in modern day in the last 100 years. And they have criticized how Christianity degraded women by calling them sinful because of menstruation. And there were witch burnings, which killed hundreds of thousands of women accused of witch. And one of the reasons for accusing them witches was because there was bleeding, because of the monthly cycle of bleeding. So I realized that all this context is simply missing in Indian tradition. We call the technical term in the Shastras is Ashaucha. There is Shaucha and there is Ashaucha. Shaucha, and it is not just about purity, impurity as also. It has a particular technical definition in the sense of providing competency for performing a karmanushtana, that is performing rituals, the Vaidika Agamika rituals, and non-performance of such rituals. Non-competency for performance of such rituals. And we speak about the panchakoshas. It is not just about physical cleanliness. Nowadays, we have sanitary pads and everything. People say we are wearing it, so we are not impure. That is not so. Wearing it does not mean the flowing of blood will stop, right? It is merely means to manage the blood, not stop it. So when this is so, there is at the pranamaya kosha, there is a heightened condition of rajas. There is a heightened condition of apanavaya. And mayomaya kosha, the mind is not stable. The mind is not calm. It is not in a sattvic condition. There is a rajoguna. That is why irritation and all women feel, right? So when I realized this, when I studied all this, and most interestingly, I came across so much of celebration and positivity associated with menstruation. We have tantric texts with their tantric traditions which consider the menstruation as the most important period for doing certain kind of sadhana. That is contrary to normal Vaidika prescriptions. And we have festivals in Odisha like Raja Parva, which was I think last month, and now we have Ambubachi in Assam. And even Karnataka, I discovered there are certain festivals among Tulu community and all, who celebrate that, who consider the divine mother, the bhumi itself as going under menstruation. So we are not a culture which promote shame regarding menstruation. Contrary to the modern narrative, see, our shyness have been misunderstood, misrepresented as shame. Why? For the sake of selling products, for the sake of commercialization. So when I realized all this, I decided I will write an series of articles. And this was the first series I wrote when I joined IndiaFex in 2016. And the first article I wrote, I had raised a lot of controversies then. Anyways, so I then wrote 6 part, 6+1 part, 6 part on Hindu views of menstruation, and 1 part just reviewing different menstruation related restrictions across the world in different cultures and different regions. I found similar restrictions across the world. My logic was simple. अरे यार पूरा दुनिया कुछ तो follow कर रहा है तो it must have some meaning, right? All the cultures for the last 5,000 years had some notion of restriction, some notion of ashaucha, and all non-Abrahamic religions also had a notion of sacrality and deities. Just like we associate Kamakya with menstruation or certain forms of Durga with menstruation, in the Greeks they had Artemis as deity of menstruation. Romans worshipped Diana. Mesopotamians had Inanna. So I know I was, but all the research came later. But the Hindu research came, and I said I will write. So I wrote 6 part article spanning around 16,000 words. So it was a small book in itself. So through 2016, I wrote these articles, and luckily, my publisher approached me herself with a request to expand it into a book. I was not sure. I thought my research is over. My work is done. I studied Hindu Dharma. I studied Hindu practices. I have written what I learned. Now my job is over. But I thought the opportunity, they don't come again and again, right? So here was a mainstream publisher who wants to publish a book on this topic and who wants me to write. I tentatively said, okay, let me think about it. And then I realized that if to have the whole thing meaningful, then I have to expand my study into other cultures. So over the next 2 years, I studied Greek perspectives on the issue, lot of books, lot of secondary literature. I studied Roman literature. I studied Mesopotamian, and Mesopotamian was the most difficult. There was nothing available online. So I luckily found that there was some seminar done by some professor who was studying this Mesopotamian notion of menstruation. I wrote to her an email expecting no reply, but she kindly replied me, and I requested that I'm writing this book. Please, I am not finding any resource material. So she shared with me a lot of papers, her own papers, published, unpublished, and some others papers also. So I based that portion based on the study of those papers, and then I studied Egyptian and then Abrahamic religion, the Judaism. I think Judaism was most interesting study, and then the Christianity, Islam, and then some native cultures, other indigenous traditions. So it took me 2 years. I finished my book in 2018, and by December it was published. So this is how it happened. I mean, nobody was taking up. If somebody had written the book already, then I would not have spent 3-4 years of my life on this.
Thank you, Nitinji. That was a detailed answer indeed. And so you have interacted a lot with the youngsters, interacted on this topic. So what kind of response do you see, and what kind of attitudinal change you see in today's times and the time when you were younger? Are they more open, or they're more skeptical about it?
Regarding menstruation, you mean?
Yes. Menstruation and discussion about menstruation. Not many people want to talk about it. It's like a hush-hush topic.
What I found was I did a 14-city tour in 2019, sponsored by the Indic Academy, and I visited across all the corners of India. I think, except for the eastern part of India, all other corners I did visit, from Bhopal and Patna and Delhi and other places to South India, Coimbatore, Madurai, Hyderabad, Warangal, so many places. And I found there's a lot of interest among people, among women, men, and everybody to this topic. Yes, there was shyness, especially among students. And when I addressed one or two colleges, they did not come up with any questions, because but I saw that, I noticed that you can notice when you're speaking from the stage that whether the children are listening or not. Many, but many were also listening, and many were keenly listening, where many were making jokes and listening, but even that is listening, right? But the response have been actually very varied. When I spoke in Warangal, I think it was addressed to IIT Warangal, I think. So there it was a small audience, but they were all very interested, and they asked questions, they interacted, and post the session also a lot of people came to me, and this was the case in Bhopal as well. And in Hyderabad, I addressed a large group of 100 plus doctors, and the interesting thing was all the doctors who were on the stage with me, who spoke before me, they they spoke on the same stereotypes about how our culture degrades women, how we are we even today we uh, propagate superstitious practices. And I had prepared a speech then, and I kept my speech aside, and I had noted down 5 points that all these doctors were speaking about, based on their own ignorance of the actual cultural scenario. And I began countering them one by one by one. So basically, it was a book launch and talk, but I ended them in a kind of a debatory mode, and people loved it. I think I sold 50 books that day. So they loved it, and it was a lot of people then came and told me that um, it was eye opening. We did not know this. We thought something else due to our own lack of reading or lack of understanding. Thank you for this. And lot of women have come and shared this with me. I was When I started this lecture tour, I was not very confident in the sense how people would receive it, especially how women would receive it. Especially now we have so a lot of feminists everywhere, and they may have problems. But even otherwise, I was not sure. I thought maybe nobody will attend it, but there were some sessions which were not well attended, but many of the sessions were very well attended, and the response was amazing. Lot of women, working women, householder women, women in colleges who are studying, all of them expressed deep gratitude. They were happy that um, they were not aware of this. I mean, I always asked whenever I saw that lot of women were there in the audience, I asked them, have did they know why they do what they do? I mean, usually the parents tell them when they start this when they have the menarche and all. In some lot of traditional households, they were parents teach, sit in a different room, don't touch this, don't this and all, but nobody tells them why to do this, what is the benefit, and why, what is the philosophical basis of it. So this was what my talk focused, and lot of them said they were very glad that they now know at least that it was not all outdated superstitious practice. So I'm very happy with the reception the book has received, though it's a kind of a semi-academic work, and it is still, even today, 2 years later, I'm still receiving once in a while some reviews, short reviews from people saying that book is good, and I still receive invites to talk on the books once in a while. So and even now on Amazon, I think sometimes I see that books are selling even now. So I take it as a very good sign.
Yes, and certainly it is also, I think it was through that series of articles that I came to know of you and your writings and things like that. So I strongly recommend, Isha, you should definitely read that book and tell your friends, your age group, women to read that book. So very, very informative, highly informative. And the cross-cultural comparison part was definitely quite eye-opening for me as well. So I know we're almost coming to the end of this, but I want us to come back to the larger question that is also sort of like the aim of our journal, the Renaissance of India. So the work that you have been doing as a writer, as a thinker, as as an individual, as a parent, what do you think, in your opinion, given that you've spent so much time and energy and you've thought so much about it, what, in your view, should be each individual's, or could be each individual's responsibility or dharma to contribute to this rebirth of Indian spirit, Indian soul? As a writer, what would you, or as a parent, as an Indian, as a dharmic person living a life of dharma, what would be your insight on that?
I think the first and foremost, we need to understand that it is over the last 50, 60 years, with the modern education system that is in place, the parents kind of given the duties of teaching to the schools, and the schools are doing very bad jobs because they are only teaching, the conventional subjects. There is no teaching on ethics, there is no teaching of culture. There is every aspect of Indian knowledge system has been thrown to dustbin by calling them religious, right? So now it is time that we take back control. Forget whatever the education system, whether it changes or not, we don't know. And I don't want to get political here. But at the level of as a parent, it is my duty. And I'm always thinking about how my daughter is just 1 year now. She's too small now. But I always keep thinking how to introduce her to dharma, how to introduce her to sadhana. See, I have a 4 pillars of a Hindu life as I see it. Shraddha, Swadhyaya, Sadachara, Sadhana. This is what I conceive as 4 pillars of a practicing Hindu. Hopefully, I will write a book on this someday. Started, but I stopped it then. So there needs to be Shraddha in the Shastras, Shraddha in the Gurus, Shraddha in the whole Parampara, because without Shraddha, everything is lost. Without Shraddha, you then start with prove, show me proof, show me proof. Shraddha does not mean blind belief. Shraddha means trust in the validity of knowledge of the Shastras and the Guru. And that trust is very most important. After that, Swadhyaya comes. That is studying of this text, studying of any aspect. It may be even engaging with the stories on Puranas. That engagement is needed. And the third is Sadachara. Theoretical understanding is useless unless it is implemented. So Sadachara, living by the Sat or the good tenets that the Shastras speak. Achara means living, practicing. Like Ahimsa Satyam Asteyam Shaucham Indriya Nigraham. This is one example. And then the sadhana. And this is perhaps the most important because we are living in a time when we are all weak, mentally weak, spiritually weak. As I think Swami Vivekananda says, strength is life and weakness is death, right? So to cultivate strength, to cultivate power, the sadhana is most important. A connection to a deity is most important. Even if your path is your path could be different, but even then, a cultivation of anchoring ourselves to a deity, to a Ishtadevata, in my personal view, is the most important thing, irrespective of your path, your sampradaya. Even if you don't have any sampradaya, then cultivating a relationship with the deity is most important because deity, the she or he, this Ishvara is the final refuge and the true refuge in life. So these are some of the things that parents have to inculcate in their children from a very young age. Without this, first parents have to learn themselves, practice themselves, and then inculcate because children learn by imitation. I know saying is easy, doing is difficult, but even if we are able to do 1%, that will be helpful. As far as Renaissance is concerned, I think it is very important that all of us who consider ourselves as Hindu, it may be politically, it may be spiritually, it may be in a deeper sense, or it may be in a surface sense. All of us have to realize that we are a civilization. And I have a Panchakosha model to understand the Hindu identity. I written on that based on the Vedantic model. Our political identity is merely the outermost identity. But when we speak of a civilizational identity, we speak a multi-level, multi-dimensional identity. One is social, one is political, one is individual, one is dharmic or adhyatmic. And so at the very core is the Shastras, the very core is the sadhana, at the very core is the Sanatana Dharma. And we have an obligation, we have a rina to this land, we have a Rina to this tradition, to our Guru Parampara, we have a Rishi Rina, to our Rishis who have given this knowledge, to conserve them, to transmit them, to protect, preserve, and promote them. How will we do it? If you don't practice it, none of the three P's will happen. I borrowed this framework from my mentor and my boss, Shri Harikaran Vadlamanaji, the founder of India Academy. He has given this framework of protect, promote, and um, preserve. So for preserving, we have to practice. For promoting and for protecting, we have to first understand. So everything starts with study, and then everything follows. So that is how I see it, that we have to uh, understand that we have an obligation, a swadharma, a part of our swadharma is an obligation to the renaissance and revival of Sanatan Dharma. And this is not only because we have a obligation to our ancestors, but it is also because we have an obligation to the greater world, a world in a Kali Yuga wherein we see adharma everywhere. The only counter to adharma is dharma, and we have obligation to establish dharma so that our future, our children, grandchildren, and their children, they can also have access to dharma. Otherwise, what will happen? India of today, it is very much possible in 100 years, there won't be our children, grandchildren will not be Hindu anymore. They could be very well be something else. The entire political scenario is completely changed. I don't want to get into politics, but it is ingrained. We cannot separate out, I will do only spiritual thing, I will not do politics thing. At least as a householder, we cannot do. That doesn't mean that everybody has to do everything. Our matadeshas, our sannyasins and acharyas, they are doing their work of preserving the essence of the tradition, the essence of Sanatan Dharma, without any spoiling, without any interpolation, without any misinterpretation. We cannot expect them to take a danda and go to a street. All of us have to find a calling that resonates with us. I am writing, for me, my weapon is my, I cannot say my pen because I don't write with my pen. I have to say my laptop. So we have to all find our calling. It may be teaching, it may be writing, it may be activism, it may be legal activism, it may be, one of the good ideas, one of the great ideas that I have is we need to revive the akhada tradition. Akharas wherein the youth, especially the men in the society, are trained. I am not physically strong person. I don't go to gym, but I think our children and youngsters must do that. So we need to revive these things. A modern gym is a modern gym. It's a secularized version. We need to akhadas wherein the physical training starts with the puja to Hanuman. So that is what is needed to. We need a Indian traditional knowledge revival in every aspect of life. Today, Dharma Shastra, nobody asks. On abortion, from the parliamentary committee to the judges in the courts, all activists speak in the language of the activists in the America. Pro-life, pro-choice, all language, terminologies, everything in the Western. What is our perspective? So I am trying to take up those topics to write upon, which everybody else is ignoring. Menstruation was one. I've written on abortion. I've also written on the question of adultery, the question, the question of homosexuality and marriage. Can they really be called as vivaha in a Hindu sense? So these are certain fundamental questions we are not asking, and we are not equipped to ask them because we have completely taken over by the attraction of the West, or the attraction of modernity, so to speak, and our values. We every day we speak about values like equality, values like liberalism, and so on and so forth. We have not even questioned, we have not even examined the very basis of these values, whether they hold any value in reality or not. So we need to start asking questions, and we need to start looking for answers to those questions in right places. Rather than reading, I don't know, Ayn Rand and I don't know what. I haven't read her actually, honestly. I don't want to read. I don't have time to read those things. We have so many. See, I recently, I'm currently studying books on Mimamsa. We have so many great names like Kumarila Bhatta, Prabhakara, Parthasarathi Mishra, Shabara, Jaimini. Nobody knows in our society that such great people there. Lot of scholarship, all lying somewhere where only a handful of people are studying. Western scholars are studying. Now they have a huge, dedicated scholarship who are working on Mimamsa. How to derive frameworks from there and make it relevant in modern knowledge systems. We are doing nothing. We have just kept it, ignored it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you really take us in all different directions, and I'm sure we'll love to have you back at some point to talk about so many other topics that you have just mentioned, and have some interesting discussion and debate about that as well. But I think the key point, sort of like take home point from what I could just point out at this point, is to really to get into the sense of questioning, asking questions and thinking independently, and doing our own homework rather than just saying West has misinterpreted, or the colonized education and all that. How long will we continue to blame, accuse, rather than actually taking action and doing our own work and taking that work as part of our sadhana, whichever topic is of our interest? And there could be different perspectives on that as well. What you are studying, what you find could be one way of understanding this, and there could be another interpretation, another understanding of that. But we have to sort of like take charge of studying our own tradition, our own.
We are a Vada tradition. We always
Yeah.
have different points of view.
Right.
We were never one point homogeneous society.
Yes, yes, yeah. Certainly, again, like coming from Sri Aurobindonian perspective, the integrality of knowledge, the uniting of all that in the light of that one, because all, again, it comes back to the Isha Upanishad also. Those who follow only Vidya would fall into the bigger, a more dangerous pit as well. So the knowledge of multiplicity and the knowledge of one have to be pursued together. So I want to kind of just close at this point and really thank you for spending so much time with us. And like I said, maybe at some point down the line, we'd like to have you back with us and pick up one of the other themes that you just briefly mentioned. So really, it's been very, very interesting listening to, from Isha Upanishad to menstruation to socio-political discussion, not necessarily a discussion, but the relevance of that understanding in the larger context of the Unitarian vision of Dharma and life, So with that, I would like to really thank you, Nitinji, for spending time with us. Isha, do you have any last words you would like to say? Or
no, I just have a suggestion that his book should be included in the curriculum for the university students.
Yeah,
it will be great.
You could write to the university. By the way, Isha is a student, is an alum of Patanjali University in Haridwar. So she has a background in yoga science, and so maybe that could be, again, like there is a whole yogic Ayurvedic understanding of menstruation that Nitin talks about in that book. So
Wonderful.
You could approach your alma mater also to incorporate, if not the whole book, at least selections from that, because that is part of the yogic knowledge tradition. So wonderful. Yeah. Okay. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Nitinji.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great to have you with us.
Really wonderful to have you with us, and all the best for your book, Isha Upanishad, and English commentary. And we are happy at Renaissance to feature selections from that book for our audience. Some of the themes I should mention are spread throughout this whole July issue of Renaissance that you've also discussed in your book on the significance of Guru, because July we also have Guru Purnima, and also the Vivek. We couldn't get into some of those concepts given the paucity of time, but I hope more people will read your book and really sort of start reflecting on those key ideas, key concepts from our tradition. So with that, thank you and namaste.
Thank you.